Hey everybody, thanks for joining us. Here for a special weekly roundup show where we're reviewing this week's security incident. That's different from last week's security incident and different from next week's. This is particularly interesting, and we have kind of cleared the schedule for the whole show to talk about it because there's a lot to say here, a lot to dig into. Joined by ActualTech Media CEO Scott Lowe. I'm James Green, VP and partner for content, and we're going to kind of break it down, give our thoughts on it. Scott's been doing a lot of reading and thinking about it over the weekend, and so I know you've got a lot to say about it, Scott. So why don't you just start by giving anybody who has not been on the internet over the weekend, because if you had, you would know about this, kind of the highest level of what's going on, what has happened, and where are we right now?
Yeah, so basically, late in the day Friday, Kaseya sent notice to its clients that they were experiencing what appeared to be some kind of an attack on their systems that they provide to manage other systems for their clients. If you don't know who Kaseya is, they're basically an RMM provider, and they manage desktops, manage servers, provide all kinds of management capabilities for people's infrastructure. And they have both direct clients as well as MSP clients. And so they have clients that are basically buying from them directly, and then they have clients that are indirectly using Kaseya through their MSP partners to manage their systems. What looks like happened from everything I've seen is that basically a ransomware as a service, which I can't even believe that's a thing, company or organization, probably not company, exploited a zero-day flaw in Kaseya's tools and inserted ransomware code that then made its way out to somewhere between 800 and 1,500 organizations worldwide as of right now. That number could change. They don't know the exact number because of the indirect nature of some of the relationships. So, they don't know exactly how many clients are under management by their MSP partners that may have been impacted. So very late in the day, it was actually 4 p.m. Eastern time, US. Kaseya put out the first notice that said something's not right here. And I was reading a bunch of Reddit forums as well, because that's kind of a really interesting place to see how things are happening in real. Basically said that Kaseya folks were emailing them, and actually the reps were calling them saying, turn off your servers, your Kaseya servers, because we're having a ransomware incident. So this was a clearly targeted attack, timed to coincide with the US and Canadian holidays, when people would have their guard down and have minimal staffing to maximize the reach of the infection. And so organizations around the world are currently trying to recover from this. The last time I looked, the organization was demanding $70 million in ransom to unlock the files that they've locked, essentially.
So I would be panicking if I was any sort of company with this sort of broad distribution, because I'm like not a genius at pattern recognition, but not that long ago, well-known software company that has broad distribution and their stuff installed in everybody's environment was the attack vector. Now we're seeing it again. I think obviously criminals learned from last time, this is a really effective way to reach a whole lot of targets at once. There's lots more tools that have this same sort of footprint, and I imagine they're having a bad weekend because they're thinking, am I going to be next? And obviously you can't know.
Well, I think you can. That's the thing. I really still think it's a matter of time for almost everybody. Maybe not everybody, because some people may do everything perfectly, but that's simply not possible in this day and age. And there's too many partnerships. I don't mean that in a bad way, but people don't write all of their own code. They have to, there's just going to be something somewhere that slips through the cracks at some point that leaves a potential vulnerability. And these kind of companies are really tempting targets for the reason you mentioned. I mean, there are thousands of companies using this, and so you can get an incredible, and I don't want to make this sound like a great business decision, but an incredible payoff by a single exploit, which again, if these kind of exploits require a lot of coordination and planning by the bad guys. I mean, this is not happening by accident. They know exactly what's happening here. And the impact is being felt worldwide on this already. There was an 800 store grocery chain in Sweden, I think, that had to shut down because their point of sale systems are all impacted because they were using this agent on their systems. And I want to be careful here because, we struggle a little bit sometimes when we talk about this to mention the company name Kaseya in this. This is not intended to bash Kaseya. There is much a victim in this as anybody else. And that's sometimes a unpopular opinion that there is much a victim because people think their code should be perfect, but it's just never going to happen. And I don't care what the software is. I don't care who wrote it. No code is perfect. And they're as much a victim in this as their customers in this case. And I feel for their teams as well as all these people who ended up working an unplanned weekend to try to help their organizations clean this mess up. And Kaseya is coordinating with the FBI and other federal agencies on response. They've talked about that a little bit in their updates on their website. So yeah, they're trying to do everything to try to they're doing the best they can is what it boils down to.
So you bring up a point that I feel like we used to talk about a lot, and then at least I personally stopped saying it so much because I felt like it was kind of overdone. But you said it's only a matter of time. That really is kind of where we're at this point. I feel like you need to kind of be approaching your security posture as if you are next instead of, oh, I hope I'm not next. You should probably just assume that you are next, and that sort of changes the security strategy you might take. So what are your thoughts on moving forward, assuming that you are next? What's kind of the high-level security strategy you might take?
Yeah, I mean, and I want to reiterate the point of I think everybody's next. I mean, if they can get their hands on data that could be in any way, shape, or form valuable, they're going to. And every business, regardless of how important it is critical. And it is critical to their operations. So in some way, shape, or form, that data has some kind of monetary value to, these black hat organizations. And as far as what organizations should be doing, it goes back to stuff we've talked about before, and that we're talking about a lot here at ActualTech Media, which is that this is ransomware avoidance and recovery is not a silver bullet. There's no single silver bullet that's going to help you make sure that these sorts of things don't happen. And when we talk about, an arrow, right? There's no single arrow, I should say. We talked about a quiver-based approach where you need to have lots of arrows in the quiver that are all working towards the same purpose to protect the organization. This goes to user training, although in this case, user training wouldn't have helped. And we have, security awareness programs that organizations are building, and they're doing security training. Again, that helps avoid a significant vector for ransomware, but not the only vector for ransomware. In this case, it appears to have been the exploitation of a zero-day flaw in the tool itself. So, that's not a user training program is not going to help there. But even early detection solutions, things like Red Canary, Huntress, things like that, to help organizations if they start to see the signs if these tools start to detect that there's potential ransomware, shutting systems down to mitigate against future or further disaster, for lack of a better phrase, taking place in the organization. We need to have decent network monitoring tools so we can understand what has been impacted. We need to have good backup and recovery capabilities so that we can recover if these things happen. Although, I talked about before the show, a lot of organizations are getting a real test of what their actual RTO is right now. Because, let me find the Reddit comment that we were talking about.
I'll explain that while you pull it up. So what I was saying is, a lot of the day-to-day use that backup and recovery systems get is, somebody needs a file that they used to have a month ago and it was mysteriously missing. So, we use the backup and restore tool to recover that file. That's one thing. But when you find out that everything you have is now useless and you need to restore it all at once, the requirements on that system and on your network are significantly different. And so, the question is, how fast can you stream recoveries of all of your servers back off of your backup appliance or appliances to the servers? And that's a different beast. And I think people are having some pain there right now.
Definitely. In fact, I'm just going to read a good chunk of a comment here. We're basically, I'm going to say forked. I didn't sleep all night babysitting restores from data for the servers we've got on there. It's a slow process given we're trying to restore so many at a time. We only have 2 data appliances for the servers we host locally. Then we have to run around to some clients to get their Hyper-V servers back up and restore from data there. For workstations, hopefully we can just do a Windows 10 refresh and throw on Office while acknowledging everything locally is host. We have to prioritize by, this is the other piece that's triaging their recovery. We have to prioritize by how many people our client organizations have, the type of business it is, and then recover based on that. So smaller organizations that don't have critical infrastructure implications or even important implications are going to be last to get recovered. Another comment somewhere basically said we're recovering anything to do with food delivery, and everything else is behind them. So it's from a, there have been lots of MSPs that have popped up over the years because it seems like an interesting business to get into. There's some obvious downsides sometimes when these kinds of incidents. But yeah, there's a lot of people that didn't get a lot of sleep this weekend because they're frantically running around, fixing this mess.
So I'm having an interesting thought about when you're designing your backup and recovery and DR strategy, something I'm not sure I've ever thought about, but you're going to need to, is where do you fall on that food chain of prioritization for all of your support vendors? If you are not healthcare or something that's going to get priority, you actually probably need to have significantly more robust systems of your own to be able to help yourself, because they're not going to be able to help you until they take care of the hospitals or whatever.
Yeah, it feels like this is a case where even if the MSPs have pretty strict SLAs with their customers, if all of their customers go down at once, I mean, there was actually somebody was posting, already people are asking, what's the legal implication here for the MSPs and Kaseya and all this? And a lawyer chimed in and basically said, probably very little. The contracts are written in such a way that, they're not going to assume millions of dollars in losses unless there was,
Right.
Obviously negligence and stuff like that could come into play, but that doesn't seem to be the case here. Like, I mean, I guess you could argue that the 0 day could be negligence, but that's probably, unlikely. They're at best going to get back like a couple of months worth of what they paid for the service, which won't begin to cover the cost, but also reinforces why cyber insurance is so important, cybersecurity insurance, because that will help make organizations whole from recovery efforts and potentially loss of business and all that good stuff as well.
And that goes back to your point about assuming that you're next. It would be a good idea to make sure that you've got insurance coverage that would be helpful in this case, because all of the things in place to try and prevent it, you do want to have a backstop for your business if you're compromised to the point where you can't recover. The companies that had that kind of cyber insurance that's going to cover them, they'll make out okay. Not that this isn't going to be a huge speed bump, but they'll survive anyway.
Yeah, and again, your point. That's another layer of. It's another layer. It's not even defense at that point. It's basically a part of the recovery side of things.
It's business defense, right? It's not technology defense, but it's business defense. So many moons on the kind of customer support team that used Kaseya, and that's how we monitored all of the clients. And I'm just thinking about like what would have happened if this had happened when I was there. Practically speaking, how well would we have been able to help? And I'm sure that like technology has changed, but it's probably not a whole lot different than it was 10 to 15 years ago. On any given week, I was supporting 30 or so clients. So if you just imagine all 30 of them are instantly wiped out right now, nobody can work. I mean, I can realistically go kick off restores and bring back systems for a couple in a day, maybe. And there were 5 or 6 of us, 7 of us that could have gotten involved. So, I mean, unfortunately, for a lot of these MSPs whose customers are impacted, there's just literally no way that they're gonna get all of these systems back online in less than maybe a week. And for some businesses, that's uh, that might be it. And
Yeah.
for a lot, they'll probably make it, but this is going to really hurt.
So Alan Conboy, Scale Computing, just commented on this post on LinkedIn, or this video on LinkedIn, and these are some things prior to today. Not all of them is things that organizations need to be thinking about in terms of, especially when it comes to ransomware. I mean, there's all kinds of potential security incidents, but ransomware seems to be the scourge that just is never going to go away. His comment is basically some of the things that we need to look at are virtualization, real-time behavior-based recognition, which there's some of those things that we have out there. I mean, things like Red Canary and Huntress do some of that kind of stuff, but we're probably looking for even more infrastructure-based tools that can be, do anomaly detection and look for weird traffic patterns and things like that.
An example of that is, there's tools that are hooked into your file server that say your rate of change is normally 2%, and over the last hour, 80% of your files have been modified. We don't think that can possibly be right. You might want to
something might be wrong.
That's what we're talking about here.
He also mentions immutable snapshots, which, absolutely. Off-platform backups. In fact, there was one of the comments on Reddit. One of the people said, as soon as I heard this was happening, we weren't impacted yet, but I removed the agent from our backup servers. And it's like, one of the things that I think organizations need to be looking at is what's shared across the entire infrastructure and minimize that sharing, especially on backup servers. Because even if they're, kept away from production, if you've got any common infrastructure, that's potentially an attack vector. And if that shared environment gets compromised, you lose your backups. Businesses fail because of that. And he mentions moving from traditional reactive infrastructure from a DR perspective to proactive infrastructure is critical. The time to get started on this was a while ago, and this attack proves the point. Zero trust is going to have to be the new norm in IT, and I completely agree with that. In fact, I do a lot of reading of some of the IT-based Reddit subreddits because they're really interesting to see what's really happening in the world, right? And there was maybe it's a Facebook group, I can't remember, but the fact that the IT people had their domain admin credentials, admin capabilities removed from their primary accounts, and they had to use a separate account, which is absolutely what has to be happening. You can't have IT people even have, their day-to-day cannot be a domain admin level account anymore, and that's been that way for a decade plus. But we still have organizations doing that. And people have to really rethink everything they're doing. Shared infrastructure, having removed this client from his backup servers, it should have never been on there in the first place.
Yeah, so I want to go down that rabbit hole a little bit. So something I think would be really useful to think about and to do for especially smaller organizations is something that big organizations with like big security teams do, and that is basically attack yourself. Not actually, but go through the process of thinking like the bad guy. Companies with big security teams have people whose job it is to sit there and think like the bad guy and bang on the door and see if they can get in. And a lot of smaller organizations, they just don't have the capacity to do something like that. But that doesn't mean you can't spend some time thinking, now if I were going to try and breach our systems, what would I do?
There's also entire companies built to do just that, to do pen testing.
Yeah. And
even get one of them.
It's not inexpensive to have it done well, but how expensive is it to be entirely compromised? So it's kind of like insurance. You're shelling out some money that you may never, see the value from, but when you do, you'll be glad you did.
Yeah, and closing those doors is critical. And I think to Alan's point, it's likely that you're still going to get compromised at some point. So your infrastructure, which is not wrong, definitely.
So still, as I'm thinking about that, not having the agent on your backup server thing, it's a good example of where, as IT pros or, system architects, we are doing that thing. We're also doing about 90 other things. And the bad guy's only job is to sit there and figure out how to compromise you. So you got to keep in mind that here you've got to deliver day-to-day services for the business and be rolling out new systems that you're building and be doing patching and 100 different things. That many different ways your attention is spread. The bad guy's only goal is to figure out how to get in. So it's worth just carving out a little bit of time to sit there and go, if I were trying to break in, what would I do? Well, once I got in, I would make sure to encrypt the backups too. Oh, okay, maybe I should make sure that you can't get to the backups, or as Alan mentioned, that the backups are immutable and it doesn't matter. But just be thinking about, in your infrastructure, you know it better than anybody else. So knowing what you know, which, don't pretend that the bad guy won't, because they will eventually. They might take a bit to discover it, whereas you know it right now. But all of the weaknesses, the skeletons that are in the closet that you know about, bad guy will find those too. So be thinking about, what would I do to compromise my infrastructure, and what do I need to do to make that not a vulnerability anymore?
Absolutely. And, or even smaller organizations at this point need to have some dedication to security. Like, we talk about the IT pro wearing too many hats, and too often we have the security is just another responsibility on someone's plate. Organizations that don't have some level of dedicated, I don't want to even say CISO, but that kind of skill set, even if it's a fractional CISO from a provider, really are doing themselves a disservice at this point. I don't know how else to put it. I mean, it's these kinds of incidents why security has become a boardroom issue. I mean, these are high impact incidents.
So Alan mentioned zero trust, and if we go back to the silver quiver you were describing, I think zero trust would be an arrow in that quiver. That is also in the sort of buzzword phase where I've started to ignore it, but I think we should spend a couple minutes talking about it, especially for anybody who's not familiar. What does zero trust exactly mean in practice? And one thing I think we should touch on is, especially for the smaller organizations you were just talking about who don't even have a dedicated security role, how would zero trust help them? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, zero trust is exactly what it sounds like. Basically, it used to be this, I mean, a long time ago, the assumption in IT was you get a new piece of gear, open it wide open, and then close things down that you didn't want to have happen. So there were lots of any rules in firewalls. So, if you don't meet one of these criteria, just go on and do your thing. And that, even with other devices, like, basically they come in a state where they just work. When we start thinking about zero trust, the assumption is that we're not going to trust anything on the network at all. We're going to assume it's all compromised, and then we're going to strategically and methodically open up only what we absolutely have to have open for applications and people to be able to work. Now, that's hard. It's really hard, especially when you start thinking about the velocity of infrastructure in a lot of organizations today. It used to, I mean, with a virtual machine-based environment, yes, there's still some velocity because you're creating and destroying virtual machines and things like that. But as soon as you move into a container-based environment where things are being created and destroyed all the time, millions a day, that velocity becomes a lot more challenging to deal with. So you need to have tools that can help the infrastructure keep up from a security perspective, with the need to make sure that nothing is actually trusted unless it needs to be trusted, and that's across the entire infrastructure. I want to mention one thing real quick. Victor Camacho from Ahead mentions that basically what we just talked about aligns with least privilege or least access model, which is exactly what we're trying to accomplish with IT not having administrator credentials. People should have the least. Again, this actually aligns a little bit with zero trust as well.
I was just going to say that
people should have the rights they need to do their jobs and not a single bit more. And that means IT uses a password, some kind of a vaulting tool, like something for CyberArk or something, to when they need to have elevated privileges, but their normal day-to-day is not going to have those level of privileges.
So the zero trust thing, the easy way for me to think about that is, for a long time, the rule in north-south traffic has been like we deny unless it meets such and such criteria, and then we let it through. But inside the network, east-west traffic basically just does whatever it wants.
Yes.
In some situations, maybe you're using a like host-based firewall, Windows firewall, or IP tables or something. But for the most part, it's just anybody does anything. And so when I think about zero trust, I'm thinking especially about east-west traffic. You assume that server A is not allowed to talk to server B ever, except under the criteria you specify. But there's one big point to make here on how that's done, which is, as you described, that scales really poorly. Because as soon as you need to say A is allowed to talk to B only on this port, keeping that up to date past 10 becomes really, really hard. So it must be policy based, because the only way to make it work when things are ephemeral and being created and destroyed all the time, like you described, is for you as the administrator to say tag policies applied based on tagging is a really popular way to do this. So anything that's instantiated that is tagged this way, apply this policy that says it may talk to things in this other group. That's how you get that to scale.
Agreed. And I thank you for the north, south, east, west discussion, because that I think solidifies it for people a lot better than I was trying to accomplish. But it basically comes back to, there are still organizations out there that believe that the edge is where the risk is. And it's just not the case. The edge is, by and large, solved. I mean, that's maybe too strong a statement, but the problem is the squishy middle these days.
Right.
Because all you have to do is have a single foothold, and you can get lots of places inside organizations. This is why one of the things we used to hear a lot about, which we don't as much anymore, is things like microsegmentation. I mean, so you can limit the potential for an attacker to infiltrate the network beyond a certain radius, right, of systems. But again, it's another tool in the security quiver to try to minimize the damage that's done from any attack, whether it's ransomware, virus, whatever it happens to be. And it's just a reality today that we have to start thinking about every system as compromised and act accordingly.
Yep. So Alan dropped another comment here, and we're pretty much out of time, so we're going to have to wrap it up. But a couple of thoughts as we go. He mentions that recent attacks seem to be targeting MSPs, and an interesting inference from that is that it's not even necessarily the MSPs that are the target so much, but it's that the MSP's customers, who are arguably the least likely able to protect themselves, which is why they've enlisted the help of the MSP, are the target here. And I think he's spot on. And
Agreed.
that's kind of scary, because remember, the bad guys have no morals, right? You and I would say to pick on the little guy who can't even help secure themselves is unfair, but bad guy has no morals like that. It doesn't matter. So a bunch of small businesses who don't even have in-house IT support and enlist the help of an MSP to do it make a perfect target, and that's kind of scary.
It is. In fact, I don't remember where I read this, and I'm not even sure if the statement is true. The bad guy having no morals. One of the things so some schools got caught up in this because they're using this tool for managing their desktops, and there was a comment that someone from the evil organization here basically said, we didn't mean for schools to get caught up in it, but what can you do? I mean, so it feels like they have some scruples in some way, but it almost feels like an anti-corporate sort of thing in some ways. And you're right. But when you think about the other reason you'd go this direction, it's not necessarily just because these organizations are least able to defend themselves, but they're also the ones. There's two other things. One is the MSPs, if you can get their tools compromised, you get much wider distribution. So your payoff is bigger. It goes back to having no morals. The second is the organizations that are that are, because they have less savvy in a lot of this stuff, they're going to be more willing to pay the ransom because they don't understand it. It's like, if I give them some money, hopefully it's not going to be business ending money. I can get my stuff back. And they're going to probably be more likely to say, do what I need to do to get back in business, because smaller organizations don't often have the kind of runway that larger organizations do, or the credit facilities that larger organizations do, or the insurance that larger organizations do, to be able to withstand an extended outage.
So I have two thoughts here as we wrap up. One, obviously, this is still very much developing. So when we're back next week or the week after to discuss, we'll maybe touch on what has happened since now. And I'm sure there will be new information and new anecdotes that'll be interesting to dig into. Second thing is we're working on a huge ransomware book at ActualTech Media that will be published in a couple months here. I think keep an eye out for that, pretty much if you're anywhere near a computer, because this is something that affects all of us, and we're putting together what we view as a pretty comprehensive resource on that subject to be ready early in the fall probably. And so we'll make sure and let everybody know when that's out. But that really kind of, it touches on each area that we were describing earlier in the silver quiver, which is like how to keep from being compromised, then how to detect that perhaps you're compromised anyway, and then how to respond if you're compromised, and on down into, and then how to restore once you determine you were compromised. We'll answer questions like, should I pay the ransom? Which is a huge question in the mind of everybody who gets compromised, and something that's debated often. We're going to, with our author, Alan, make an attempt to answer that question. So keep an eye out for that. Anyway, Scott, thanks for looking into this and sharing your thoughts. And thanks, everybody, for joining us on the stream. Thanks, Alan and Victor, for your comments. And to everybody else, please join us next week on LinkedIn and YouTube. We'll give you an update on what we know then.
Thanks, everybody.